I'm getting my game face on, Move. I'm ready.
He's getting his game face on.
Perfect.
Or is everyone's game face on?
I only have one face.
You only have one face. Are you not able to switch? You can't put your angry eyes in.
I don't like this bit.
This bit is now the beginning of the podcast. Hi, welcome to When the Lights Go Out. I'm Eli.
I'm Moof.
And I'm Matt.
Yes, Matt, you are indeed Matt. And today we're going to talk about ACL injuries. So that's fun.
It is not fun.
No, probably not. Usually if you see someone get an ACL injury or something, a major knee injury, they're usually crying. Kind of a downer. Matt, how you doing today?
I'm fantastic, Eli. Yourself?
I'm pretty good, Moof.
I'm also pretty. I'm having a fantastic day.
Fantastic time?
Yeah.
That's great. Well, so as I kind of said before in the weird bit portion of the introduction, we're talking with Matt. We're gonna talk a decent amount about ACL injuries, kind of what they are, and then we're gonna focus a lot on how like the reconstruction works in surgery, and maybe a lot about the rehabilitation. So I believe Moof has some statistics or something to that effect.
Yeah. So I did some, basic Googling, and I found some most likely causes for ACL injuries. I found this on the Mayo Clinic website, and the three most common causes for injury are subtly slowing down and changing direction. So cutting if you're playing a high intensity sport like football, soccer, lacrosse, basketball. Um, Pivoting on your foot while it's firmly planted is another thing, and
Firmly planted.
yes, and receiving a direct blow to your knee or a collision to the knee, such as a tackle in football, how Carson Wentz tore his ACL
Rip Carson
that
Wentz.
Rams game.
Are you okay? Are you still okay?
I mean, moving on to risk factors. So some risk factors I found on the same website, the Mayo Clinic. One, just right off the bat, being female apparently is a risk factor for ACL tears.
50% of the population.
Yes, a little more. Yeah. Participating in certain sports such as soccer, football, basketball, gymnastics, downhill skiing are risk factors.
Is there uphill skiing?
I think that's called the lift that takes you
That's
up.
fair. Or just walking in snow up a hill.
Yeah.
Hiking.
Poor conditioning, wearing footwear that doesn't fit properly, using poorly maintained sports equipment such as ski bindings that aren't adjusted to your body or your feet or your legs properly.
Mm-hmm.
And then one I found that apparently is very, very critical. It's a very big risk factor is playing on artificial surfaces. It's I didn't realize how big of a risk factor it is, but apparently you are 1.36 times more likely to have an ACL injury if you're playing on artificial surfaces.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, just ask the 49ers this past season.
Yeah.
They got how many ACL tears in 2 weeks on the same turf? 3, 4?
Yeah,
major
4, yeah.
on the D line, no less.
Yeah.
It was,
yeah.
And then it was pretty crazy.
Anything I didn't mention, Matt? You want to add to it?
That all sounds pretty good to me. Yeah, a lot of the ACL injuries, when you think of getting injured, you think of somebody getting hit like in football, but a lot of ACL injuries are non-contact, which some people don't realize. A lot of them are just somebody running and maybe they're around the other team, but they don't necessarily get hit. They just plant the wrong way. So not a lot of it is actually caused by like a hit or contact.
Yeah. And but before we get into the kind of big Matt questions, I also did some research. And so there's something like 100,000 to 200,000 ACL tears per year in the United States. And this is according to Beaumont.org, which, I mean, that's a lot, right? Like, how many people are in the United States? 300 million, something like that. But I mean, 100,000 to 200,000 of a specific injury is a lot. And so that's not just sports injuries. But then if you look at children 14 and younger, like about 3 to 4 million of them annually have some sort of sports related injury. So in both of those cases, it's not just like professional sports players in professional sports games. It's like regular people can get ACL injuries. Children, when playing sports, because so many children play sports, they can get injuries. And that is according to Johns Hopkins. And then I also have, I was looking at a paper. It's called a multi-sport epidemiologic, I think that's a word, comparison of ACL injuries in high school athletes. And actually that with I took that information and then I looked at how many high school athletes there are, generally speaking. And so I looked at the NCAA. They have information about that. So there's apparently about 8 million high school athletes a year. And so if you kind of extrapolate the information from this paper, it's something like something like 20,000 ACL injuries in high school athletes alone. And I mean, these are like, 14 to 18-year-olds. These are kids. So there's a decent amount of ACL injuries in people you probably know, someone in your town. Like, I didn't realize how many of these injuries there are in just, like the average person.
I think the high school injuries are kind of exasperated by artificial surfaces because the entry level to artificial surfaces, the cost versus like just grass surfaces is higher, but the cost to maintain artificial surfaces is a lot cheaper, and the drainage is better. So a lot of high schools are switching to artificial surfaces to get a better like cost benefit ratio, and that's causing more of those ACL injuries that we're seeing in high schoolers.
Yeah, I can imagine that with the like varying climates all over the United States and really the world. There are a lot of places where it's super dry, and there are a lot of places where it rains a lot, or there's a lot of precipitation. And like high schools generally don't have the kind of funding that like a college or professional sports team would have to, maintain their field. So like ease of maintenance is probably a big deciding factor in those cases. All right, now it's time for the Matt questions. Matt questions.
Matt's the only one who can answer these questions.
That's the only one who can answer these questions. If anyone else answers the questions,
They're wrong.
They're wrong because
They're wrong.
these are Matt questions.
Matt, go ahead and give us your credentials.
These are Matt credentials.
Tell us what you know.
Who are you?
Well, I guess my credentials start with my bachelor's degree, which we have all obtained in different areas.
Yes.
But mine specifically is in kinesiology.
Bless you.
Thank you.
That was a weird way to say that. We've all
move everything you say is a weird way to say anything, and same for me. So this is perfect.
We've all obtained credentials, but mine is.
It's true. If I am a witness, Matt does have a bachelor's degree in kinesiology.
Yes.
Thank you. You're currently in a PT program, right?
That's correct. I'm going through Baylor University. I'm getting my doctorate in physical therapy. I'm about
There you go.
I started in January, so I'm about a month and a half in.
Nice.
Sweet. Nice, dude.
Nice. And you've also played baseball for pretty much your entire life, right?
Yeah, I started playing t-ball. Played all the way through high school. Played not for my college, but I played for a couple years in college.
Yeah, I mean, and you're really just one drop shoulder away from making club, right? So Matt has
So
a
has
problem
been
where he
said.
drops his shoulder instead
So
of
it has been said.
driving through. It's okay.
It's okay. It's okay.
Anyways, so now for the first Matt question. I'm going to ask this question because I really don't know anything about this. Matt, what's an ACL?
Well, Eli, funny you should ask.
Oh, geez, that's more complicated than I thought.
So your ACL is that ligament that you see in the middle of the screen.
If you're listening on audio, just try to imagine this.
So you
Imagine a picture of an ACL which you don't know anything about.
so you have your femur, which is your thigh bone, the bone in your upper leg. And you have your tibia, which is your main shin bone. There are two bones down there, but your tibia is the one that you actually feel as your shin. And your ACL is a ligament that connects those two bones. There are a ton of ligaments that go into the knee joint, but that's just one of them. And it's the ligaments are kind of they're made for their tensile strength, so they're like pretty dense, and it's dense regular connective tissue that's in ligaments, so that ligaments are made up of, and they really like resist pull and tension a lot. So that's good for your knee stability, right? But your ACL specifically runs from the back of your femur. So yeah, if you kind of it runs from the back of your femur to essentially the front of your tibia. And if you can sort of visualize a knee or look at the one on the screen, if you're watching the video, if you basically the ACL resists forward movement of the tibia. Now, I guess to explain that a little bit, if your knee is bent and you try and pull your lower leg forward or like away from your knee, if that makes sense, the ACL is the main ligament that resists that movement. So somebody that actually tears their ACL, one of the things you can do, obviously, besides going in with an arthroscopy and actually like visualizing the tear in the ACL, you can do certain tests. One of them I think is called the Lockman's test, and basically you can do what I was explaining. You can pull the your tibia forward, and there will be a lot more movement than if there was an intact ACL. Anyways, that was a little bit of a tangent.
No, that's really interesting.
That's useful information.
Everything about the Loch Ness Monster, I think, is interesting. You actually kind of started getting into it, but we're both curious, Luke and I, about like what happens when you tear it.
So there are different, I guess, levels of severity that can be classified under an ACL tear. If you're using the word tear, if you tear it, you can either partially tear it or completely tear it. And a complete tear would be, it's a little more violent, but it's pretty similar to just like taking a pair of scissors and just like cutting it in half. Like it's the now two parts of the ligament are completely dissociated from each other. So that's a complete tear. And that is, I guess, what people commonly think of when they hear an athlete that tore their ACL. It's usually a complete tear. But the partial tear is just when one of the sides is ripped or partly torn. So the ligament is still fully intact from one side to the other. It's just maybe not fraying, but it's just partially ripped. So it still connects.
It's losing some of that tensile strength you were talking about earlier.
Right.
Can you also like strain your ACL? Is that true?
So strains are for muscles,
Never mind.
and sprains
Never mind.
with a P. Sprains are for your ligaments.
Sprain. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So
That sounds right.
when you sprain an ankle, you are damaging the ligaments in your ankle.
Okay. This is why we have Matt here. And
Now,
not
this is another kind of small question, but can you lose elasticity of your ligaments? Is that a thing?
Um, so you actually want your ligaments to be fairly stiff.
Mm-hmm.
They also have some elasticity, but like if it's immobilized for a long period of time, that can cause some adverse or undesirable effects.
Cool. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Cool. And we can go to the next thing. So, what can be done to repair a torn ACL?
So there are two main options that people have. One of them is a surgical repair, and one of them is, I guess you could say, a non-surgical repair or conservative treatment with just therapy, physical therapy. And typically, surgery is a good choice for athletes in high-intensity sports or a young, healthy population that still want to be active and still kind of, yeah, basically still living an active life. And the conservative treatment, which is actually where you don't ever go into the knee and physically repair the ligament, but you just treat it with basically a lot of stability exercises and other modalities that can promote the healing. But that would be maybe for an older population that wouldn't respond as well to the effects of surgery, because surgery can be, the ACL surgery is a fairly less invasive when you compare it to a lot of the other things like hip replacement, but it's still surgery. You're still cutting into somebody's knee. So if you're maybe an older population if you're in the older population and maybe you don't want to go out and play basketball every weekend, if you're just comfortable, like whatever you activities you do in your daily life, like walking or anything like that, a conservative treatment might be better for you.
So it just comes down to how active you plan to be in the future. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like
that's one
between
of the
two
variables.
options.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still wear like some sort of brace if you do like the conservative approach?
I'm actually not sure. I my initial guess would be that you would for stability, at least in the initial stages.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to become dependent on a brace, because if you wear a brace all the time, then because what a brace does is supports the area that it's bracing. So that's also the job of your muscles when you're not wearing a brace. So if you wear a brace, your muscles don't have to work as much to stabilize the area.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wear a brace for too long, then your muscles will weaken and they won't be as effective. But
Oh, cool.
I would assume that initially you would want to be in a brace.
Okay. Cool.
Cool.
And there are actually two, going back to the surgery part, there are two different, I guess, types of surgery.
Mhm.
So what you want to do is basically clear out the broken ligament, and you want to replace it with something else. And typically it's called a graft is what you would replace it with. And there are two types of grafts.
Bar graphs and
The
circle
T.
graphs.
Precisely. That's an Eli question right there.
That's what we're here for.
Yes.
Yeah, so one of them is you would take a tendon from another part of your body, typically your hamstring tendon, and put that basically in place of your old ACL. And there's another one where you actually would not use another part of your own body, but you would use like a cultured tendon from a donor or a cadaver, and you would replace your ACL with that instead.
Huh. Okay, that's pretty cool. So once you have this new ACL in place, or you're not going through surgery, what's the rehab process like? And I guess there are two different rehab processes, or are they the same? This is why we ask the questions, Matt.
These are the Matt questions.
These are the Matt questions.
Well, it's going to be a slightly different rehab response depending on if you do surgery or not. Partly because a lot of the initial rehab post-surgery is basically getting better from the actual surgery itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like because you are getting cut open and something new is inserted into your knee. So they are going to be slightly different, but it's an injury to the same area of the body, so they're going to be pretty parallel to each other, maybe just with a different timeline.
That makes sense. So this is my most important question. Okay? So
I'm ready.
what's like the timeline of the rehab process and recovery? And like how long would you say does it take to get to like 95 to 100%? Basically what I'm trying to ask is Carson Wentz fully recovered yet? Like will he be good this year?
This is assuming he doesn't get traded, as this is probably before that would ever happen.
I need to know.
From his ACL injury?
Yeah, like 2 years ago.
Is that the reason he's bad, or is he just bad?
Well, I won't make any speculations on that, but
very political answer.
I will say that and it varies individual to individual, and there's kind of a shift away from making rehab, at least from an ACL, time-based. There's a shift towards making it like check mark or criteria-based. Progress-based, yeah. So that speaks a little more to the individual that is going through the rehab. So if you tear your ACL or if Eli tears his ACL, like
it's gonna take me five years probably.
You may not be doing the same exact things at the 1 month or the 3 month mark.
I fully expect to be ready in 6 months, like Adrian Peterson, and then run for 2,000 yards in a professional football season.
Yeah.
Is that not going to happen for me, Matt? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm taking away from Matt's answer is Carson Wentz is not fully recovered. And,
you can choose what you want to believe in that case.
Well, so the average rehab from an ACL tear will take around 9 to 12 months.
It has been longer than that for Carson.
It has been 3.5 years.
It's been like 2.5 years.
A little more than, I think it's been a little more than 3 years. Was it 2017?
It was like October of 2017.
So about 3.5 years. It's 2021.
Oh shit. Go on, Matt. You were gonna say something.
Well, to be honest, I forget what I was going to say.
That's
but-
okay.
That's it.
I really quickly though, we're about to end, but is there like I guess what are the exercises that people generally do when recovering, or do you? I mean, I assume it's like a bunch, right? But like, what's the kind of basic idea behind the rehabilitation?
Is it like stability based, strength based? Like, is it a combination of both? How, in what phases do they happen? I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you have all those components that you mentioned in the rehab process. If we're talking post-surgically, one of the very first things that you want to do is just decrease the swelling and the inflammation from the surgery, and you want to increase range of motion as much as you can. So that we're finding out more and more that the earlier you do that, the better outcomes you'll have. And initially, you also want to work on muscle activation. So particularly of your quadriceps, because when you have ACL surgery, you pretty much immobilize your knee for a short period of time, and the muscles like the quadriceps that move your knee,
Mm-hmm.
if you can't move your knee, the muscles that move your knee won't be used.
That makes sense.
Makes
Yeah.
a lot of sense. So one of the things that is good, at least initially, maybe when you don't have full range of motion, is doing, it's called isometric exercises. And iso meaning same, metric meaning length. So a lot, like typically you'd think of an exercise as moving a joint, right? Like a bicep curl. You move your elbow, but you can also activate muscles without moving the joint. So if you think about keeping your leg flat on a table, and one of the common cues is to push the back of your knee into the table, or basically just flex or activate your quads without actually flexing your knee joint, without moving your knee joint. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really interesting.
So that's one of the common exercises that you will do pretty soon after surgery,
Mhm.
just so you can cause as little or prevent as much atrophy as you can and keep your muscles kind of strong.
That's really cool because I feel like when you see people recovering from injuries, specifically ACL injuries, you see like Sports Center will be like good surgery, and then 6 months later they'll show a picture of the guy with the brace like running, and they'll be like, and he's kind of hobbling, but he's like, it's like clearly like, okay, like this is better, and they'll be like, he's running again, and there's never that the like 4 months in between those two things. You never really see that. So I didn't realize just kind of like keeping your leg stable is something that, which makes a lot of sense because aren't you building stability? That's cool.
Yeah, and another important part, kind of, well, I guess you could start it early, but more important later on too, is you want to get the hip nice and strong and stabilized too, because your hip being stable basically influences the stabilization of your knee, because all those muscles around your hip, well, not all of them, but most of them, a lot of them attach to the femur, which is that thigh bone that we mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
And if they are nice and strong and stable around the femur, then the femur is also a part of the knee joint. So that will also stabilize your knee as well. So a lot of the times people think of an ACL rehab, oh, I'm just going to be doing knee exercises.
Mhm.
And that's really not the case at all. You really want to be doing knee, hip, ankle, core, balance, like all sorts of stuff will help the stability of your knee.
Wow, that's definitely something that I feel like a lot of people don't really realize. Because whenever you hear an ACL injury, you're like, oh, it's clearly a lot of work. But I didn't realize how much of your body you need to be using during the recovery process, like actively for recovery. So that's really cool. Well, I think we're done for today. Thank you so much for coming, Matt. Always a pleasure talking to a good friend of the show. So before we leave, I'm just gonna say, if you like what you heard, we have a website, whenthelightsgoutpodcast.com, and you can kind of find some of our stuff on there. We have social media at WTLGO Pod on Instagram and Twitter, and we have a YouTube channel now where if you're seeing us, that's where you're seeing us. Yeah. So you look up When the Lights Go Out on YouTube, and you can see us there. And again, we're on all platforms, all podcasting platforms.
Anything you want to plug, Matt?
I've got nothing, Move. I've got nothing. I study every day, and that's all I do. So.
All right. Matt is plugging education.
Make sure stay in school.
Stay in school.
Matt's trying to get smarter for the next podcast we have on.
Yeah.
We have him on. So, anyways, thanks so much for listening. I'm Eli.
I'm Moof.
And I'm Matt.
And stay in school. Thanks for listening to When the Lights Go Out. See you next time.
Peace.
Play the music.
Do, 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 do.
Matt, you should dance.
Do, do.